Hello, and welcome to Part 3 of the Praxist Table Talks analysis of Julius Evola's Revolt Against the Modern World. My name is Vincent, I'm the founder of Praxia, and I have with me a member of our Leadership Council today, Cody. How are you doing today?
Doing very well.
This is the second time we're attempting to record this. The first time my mic kind of cut out, and I didn't realize that I didn't turn it up, so there you go. But anyways.
Thus it goes with technical difficulties.
Yeah, right. But our last episode dealt with chapters 3, 4, and 5, which it had quite a bit to do with the different topics relating to capital T traditional makeup of society, which would be chapter 3 dealt with polar symbolism. The second chapter, or chapter 4, dealt with the nature of the state, and the third, chapter 5, dealt with the importance of rites and rituals. And I was saying that, generally speaking, I would say that the capital T traditionalist society, it very much mirrors the image of Praxism that we have, and the aspects of reality that we're trying to emphasize in our own works. And so, I think the value that we can find in the writings of Julius Evola is how he's able to understand the formula behind the various forms, and then articulate that formula through a book like this, where we can kind of like look through this compendium of different traditions and different things like that, and say, okay, well, this is how this would look in practice. This is how this would look in practice. I think that's the value that we can find in the traditionalist school. So the chapters that we are going to deal with today are chapter 6, 7, and 8, which are chapter 6 deals with the primordial nature of the Patriciate, which is kind of like that upper class. It's kind of like the split between the upper castes and the lower castes. Patriciate would be in opposition to plebeian then, or the common caste. Chapter 7 will deal with spiritual virility, or vril, as people like to jokingly call it. And chapter 8 will deal with the two paths in the afterlife, which is kind of like a good closure of the preceding two topics. So, once again, Cody, how did you feel when reading these for the first time?
I initially read and reread the chapters to make sure I fully absorb what it's saying. And I think in my rereading of this, it is a very good transition and addition to the last 6 chapters that we've gone over, particularly with the primordial nature of the Patriciate coming down into a more focused sense on these ancient societies, whereas we were dealing with kings and states and the divine aspects on which these nations or peoples are founded, and looking down more into the atomic structure of society, which is the family unit, and especially the higher caste of families versus the lower castes, and why they are separated in their behaviors. That was a very good distinction, and something that we can clearly see and identify even in today's society, where very little has changed in these aspects, except for the surface level facades and the detailic nature of our expressions of those castes. Otherwise, excuse me, having a bit of a muscle spasm.
Oh no, you're good.
I think I'm all good.
Okay.
Otherwise, into the other 2 chapters, it's a further exploration of these rites and rituals that we explored in the last episode as well, and what Evola digs deeper into why they're important in society, and why they are necessary in the differentiation of caste, and how these things are kind of a priori to the human dignity that exists, and not just some imposition from a source of power. It's something that exists within the soul of a person themselves before they're even born, and then it's just actualized into the real world, and they can either, like we discussed in the last episode, adhere to that structure that they belong to in their caste, or they can abandon and rebel against it, and that will have various consequences to their society, and they'll be looked upon or dealt with in certain ways depending on how successful they are in that rejection of their born nature.
Right. Yeah, I think that was a pretty good opening statement. So I think we're ready to kind of just jump in here. So chapter 6 on the primordial nature of the Patriciate. This chapter has to deal with, the idea of the Patriciate himself, or the patrician caste, or that was
the patriarch.
Yes, exactly. And that was the patrician caste was at least the name that they were given in Rome, I believe. But this caste came, within every society, and he examines a few different societies besides just Rome. But he references, so the way Evola does it is he'll reference a thing, and then he'll reference that thing as the example principle that he gave. So, for example, this would be like the patriciate caste would be the patriciate because that is the name by which he referenced it. That doesn't mean that in other traditional societies that this caste took the same name, but it had the same function. And so when he references the one, he's using it as an umbrella term for other castes or other civilizations' castes of the same function or of the same stature. So it's not just in Rome that he's talking about. It's go ahead.
As he starts out, sorry, wow, still getting choked up here. My apologies. As he starts out with the chapter, like Vincent says, he begins with the Brahmana in India and how, they're by another name, but the hierarchy thereof is this spiritual caste of men, mostly, that are the forefathers of their civilization. And so they're the ones that have this quality in them that is therefore delivering of rites and rituals and the maintaining of culture as it is in society.
Right. In the last chapter, I believe it was one of the last chapters, he said that the rites were originally the prerogative of the king, and then they were the prerogative of the priestly caste, and then they were the prerogative of the patrician families, or the patriciates themselves, which are these, essentially the patriciate would be the patriarch of a given noble family. So it would be like the highest head of a given noble family. So he opens the chapter by saying, "The Indo-Aryan civilization exemplifies one of the most thorough applications of the foregoing principles. In this civilization, the Brahmana caste, like Cody was mentioning, was not at the top of the social hierarchy by virtue of its material strength or its wealth, or even of its para-ecclesiastical organization. Only the sacrificial rite, which was its privilege, determined its higher status vis-a-vis other castes. By permeating those who performed them with some kind of dreadful and beneficial psychic power, the rite and sacrifice allowed the Brahmana to partake of the same nature as the evoked powers. Not only would this quality abide in that person forever, making him directly superior to and revered and feared by others, but it would also be transmitted to his descendants." So you have this idea of someone who originally performs a rite and then becomes a patriciate. So this is like that initiation into the higher caste type of stuff that we've talked about before, or that becoming of a novus civis, or that deification of an individual. That's what the patrician caste represents. So this is the tradition that would characterize that greater individual, that initiated individual, as being superior, or as becoming a quote-unquote spiritual father, who is the identifiable patriarch and ancestor of his own family, and then his family would have those same qualities latent within them, if that makes sense. So everyone who is descended from this person would have that same quality that he has, based on the maintenance of the rite that they maintain, if that makes sense. So he says the dignity of a caste was determined both by...
Sorry, excuse me, I was muted.
Oh, okay. Did you answer?
I wanted to interject. Relative to the Catholic Church and canonization in that respect of what you were just saying, it's like the levels of dedication to the teachings of Christ, and how you might go from, just a regular practitioner of the church to a monk to a priest himself, and it's the dedication of these ritual and rites. And if you are of such a high-standing holy man, you might be canonized in the church doctrine as a saint. And we'll get into later on the two paths in the afterlife how that's kind of similar to what Evola describes in this Olympian immortality, in the shadow or daemon, two different aspects, but is kind of fused together in the Christian rite of things, where that soul of the person will then be immortalized in the physical world as well as in the ethereal world for the virtues that they displayed in their lifetime.
Yeah, yeah. You'll find out a lot of these things overlap within the spiritual world. You have like you said, the shadow and the daemon, which are two fundamentally different things. They kind of overlap in the same way that I think another word to exchange those with would be like soul and spirit, and then depending on the context and how you would use it, those are two other concepts that would overlap, and those are more familiar with Christians, I think. Soul and spirit being kind of fused together but separate in their own various properties. Whereas the soul is that individual I, and then the spirit would be that generative force that precedes the I, or that generates that life force within the person. Basically, the soul, in a sense, directly and sequentially succeeds the spirit, in a sense, and so that spirit would be that. The spirit would be that spirit of the ancestor. It would be that direct source from the individual, or that direct source from which the individual comes out.
We'll get more into it once we get to that chapter.
Yeah. But anyway, so he says having entered the bloodstream as some sort of transcendent legacy, this quality would become the characteristic feature of a race that is activated in individuals by the rite of initiation. So what I was talking about, how that characteristic, or that superhuman, or should I say suprahuman, not necessarily superhuman, but that suprahuman characteristic that was exhibited by that ancestor who established the family or the lineage or the stock, this characteristic becomes passed down through the bloodstream, but it doesn't become activated. It stays latent or dormant until that person undergoes an initiation. So the rite of initiation has some significance here in activating that characteristic within a given person. Even if they may be born of that caste, they still need to undergo that initiation. Says the dignity of a caste was determined both by the difficulty and by the usefulness of the function it exercised. Because of the above-mentioned presuppositions, in the world of tradition, nothing was cherished more than the spiritual influences that the rite could activate through necessitating action. Nothing appeared as difficult as entering into a real and active relationship with the invisible forces that were ready to overcome the imprudent person who dared to confront them without possessing the necessary qualifications and knowledge. These qualifications being that dormant characteristic, and then obviously the spiritual knowledge to undergo that. For this reason, the Brahmana caste, despite the fact that it was scattered throughout India, could evince the respect of the masses and enjoy a prestige that no tyrant ever enjoyed, no matter how well armed. So this reinforces the point that the Brahmana caste, or what would either have been the regal caste or the patriciate caste, depending on how you look at it, this was a right, R-I-G-H-T right, that was enjoyed specifically by them, by the nature, or because of the nature of their caste themselves, by the nature of their personhood. Anything to add before we kind of go on?
Oh, I believe we did talk about that a little bit on the first episode, on how no matter how much force you can give behind a certain power or a certain unifying force in a society, that it will all fall apart essentially if it doesn't have some sort of higher purpose behind it. And as you can see in India, it's still going today because it has that higher spiritual nature to them. In the Brahmana, things are getting a little wonky nowadays because of modernity affecting all things. So the caste system in India is coming under a lot of fire, but even still, it's held on to like a 4,000-year tradition. So very robust system that it's maintained that sort of power structure despite all the invasions and occupations and subjugations that India's faced thereof, and the modern problems it faces now too, the existential threats like China.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some legitimacy to organizing how they do. There might be better ways of doing that for different peoples, because not all the peoples on the planet are like those of the Indian subcontinent. but a similar means of organization is definitely probably one of the best ways to go about it, just with some tweaks and adjustments to properly, how would you say?
I guess formulate a new form.
Accommodate
Yeah,
is
okay,
the right word I wanted, to accommodate those different peoples.
Yeah, and that's what we try to deal with here with Praxism is trying to strip that. It's trying to get that one step further beyond that formalism. You have the caste principle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the caste need to be structured in any specific way, just that they do need to be structured according to that specific principle. So you wouldn't necessarily have that caste structure in India become copied and pasted over to, some other more modern country. What you would do instead was apply that caste principle, which can be found that precedes the formal caste that you would find in India. You would have that principle generate that same type of formulation for, whatever country you're trying to apply it to, and that caste and that principle would take its course and manifest something unique, but still having identifiable within it the same principle of the caste that can be found in India. So it's that same perennial idea.
It's much like the writers of liberalism during the Enlightenment, who were very much conscious of the fact that this form of government wouldn't really work outside of the context of Western, more or less modernized, white European societies, and they stated that just as much, where this system of organization and formalization needed all the necessary baggage of, say, like an Anglo-Saxon Christian society that had all of these moral principles and foundations and institutions and structures behind them in order for this formulation of government or philosophical legwork to function properly. And now we're living in the consequences of globalization that have ignored those facets of liberalism, and we see the consequences thereof with all of this animus and degradation and so forth in countries like the US or Canada or the UK and so on.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I dislike about the ideological products of the Enlightenment, is the fact that they are so relative to the times that they were created, and they were created intendedly so, which is a problem. I think it's also expressed in Evola's work, and it's expressed in Guénon's work as well, that these ideologies are subordinated to more holistic traditional ideologies because they are so relative and require some type of higher reference point, whereas the ideology of traditionalism, for example, would be self-referential, and it would be able to be so because it is a more holistic, eternal, and timeless ideology, where you could say, right now, these principles apply right now, whereas, with the post-Enlightenment ideologies and the Third Estate ideologies especially, you would need some kind of historic precedent. But this chapter here, the primordial nature of the Patriciate, I should have opened with, it differentiates between two ideas. It differentiates between the common caste and then the patrician caste. And so these are the two focuses here. And it kind of contrasts them and shows why that patrician caste is deserving of its spot in society. It is deserving of that hierarchical position. So, for example, he references here, he says, there is a Chinese saying, the rights are not the legacy of ordinary people. And then he also he talks about a Latin expression. He says, a Latin expression characterized the plebeians as gentem non habent, people who have no rights nor ancestors. So I constantly make reference to the the greater and the lesser individual. And one of the biggest things that I say is that the greater individual is characterized as being a father himself, being a spiritual father, and that the lesser individual is said to have been born and died, making no ontological shift in status, or being quote unquote fatherless in that same sense. So this is where that idea comes from, is this idea from China, from Rome, what have you, that the uninitiated individual or the plebeian individual is fatherless in the sense that they do not have a patrician ancestor to devote their rights to, or someone who can or who has the authority to perform their rights, if that makes sense. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, tons. That last point right there is easier to be understood in a differentiation, as the greater individual are those who shape society, those historical figures you can name readily off the top of your head, the Alexanders, the Bonapartes, the whomevers. Those are all individuals that have gone through their rights, gone through their trials, and made themselves foundational figures or exemplary figures, continuing the traditions of their society, whereas the lesser individuals are those that make up the masses. That might be the easiest way to kind of understand how we're talking about it in these contexts.
Yeah.
But kind of what you were saying off of the relativity of liberalism as well, there is the point of people forgetting those greater contexts in which we live in. And part of that being the Patriciate is that our societies were mostly all patriarchal societies, and we had this at the head of great men who made families of themselves and had houses that they reigned over, like lesser kings that acted as nobles because they were noble in action, and that's how you get that differentiation. What we see now in this degeneration, like Evola says here down the page, is plebeians not having the privilege of the second birth characterized in what's called the Arya, the noble. And that's that initiatic form. Most people conflate things like going to college or getting a degree in something being that sort of second birth or somewhat, because it's an achievement that they've unlocked somehow through the institutions that we have in our society. But that is a misnomer in our modern degradation. And so you have many of these university graduates, many women out of the social sciences, going down the route of feminist societies, wanting to deconstruct and something else, the patriarchy. There's a lot of D's in these social sciences that de-radicalize, whatever, because they're always working relative to a tradition or an institution that they want to tear down in a way. This postmodernist modernity, in forgetting the past completely and living in the eternal now, living in the complete relative aspect of society, in which things like a patriarchy, which is a natural and effective form of organizing ourselves, is something that these plebeians who have replaced the patriciates of our forefathers past are eroding as we speak. And so it's becoming ever harder to perpetuate or even organize an effective society that can withstand things like the economic or social troubles that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, I 100% agree. There's a couple things you said. There's a couple things, that you touched upon that I wanted to further expand upon. You were talking about how people like to live in the eternal now. I would actually say so. That is a religious term that does have a positive connotation to it, which is essentially saying that external to all temporalities, there is this idea of the eternal now, which is right now. It's like that idea of, if you push your mouse with your finger and your mouse stops moving, and your will stops pushing your finger, the mouse stops moving that same instant, like right now. That is what is considered to be the eternal now. So I know what you're saying by like, they live in
temporary forms of speaking. Yeah.
Yeah. I know what you're saying, colloquially or something like that. But the eternal now is actually not necessarily a bad thing to live in if you're living in it, properly by understanding that definition, because it means that you are referencing things outside of temporality and that you have that, intuition that's innate to the intellect. But most people, I would say, don't have that. So not to confuse the terms or anything.
a heavy Buddhist concept as well, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has to do with gnosis and stuff like that too. So yeah, it just depends on which tradition you go down. But then also, you mentioned that the plebeian replaced the patriciate, and yeah, that is exactly the problem, right? You mentioned that we have the same structure for society, relatively, more or less, with upper caste families and lower caste families, but that what the formal castes are, or what the manifested idea of the caste system is now, is kind of a hollow shell of what it used to be. Where you have the same structure, more or less, but the structure is not held up by the same materials. It's not made out of the same thing. So you have these upper castes, or upper classes, really, is what I would call them, because caste, does have that spiritual connotation to it, whereas class has merely an economic connotation to it. So what I would say now is you have the quote-unquote caste principle being subverted and perverted by the economic principle, which creates these newer social classes which closely resemble the castes in form but not in function. So you have these post-Third Estate revolutions, which would be the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the various revolutions that took place throughout Latin America, South America, and in Europe at the time of the Enlightenment, and a little bit past then. What these created was an upheaval of the traditional aristocracies that were there, and replaced them either with a military dictatorship or a civilian dictatorship, which is kind of even worse than the military version of it. And it replaced all these upper castes with wealthy common caste uninitiated individuals, so people who are not deserving of that spot on the social hierarchy. So what Evola's trying to get at here is that this principle of hierarchy is not what we need to take down, but we need to return it to its original state. It needs to have that specific function that it had before, which was that the people at the top were qualitatively superior, not simply quantitatively superior. It's also one of the topics of René Guénon's book, which is the reign of quantity, and it does have some validity in the sense that the plebeian castes, or the plebeian caste finally acquired enough quantity to overthrow the patrician caste and the upper castes as well, but they never surpassed them in quality. And so what you have now is that upper class is being ruled by people who are still of the same caste as the common folk. So it's this false sense of superiority that they have. Go ahead.
Here's this excerpt from Evola himself saying that only in recent times has aristocracy, like royalty, taken on a mere secular and political character. In later times, a plebeian view of aristocracy arose that denied the privileges of blood and tradition. A typical example of the later view is the so-called aristocracy of culture, or aristocracy of intellectuals, that arose as a byproduct of the bourgeois civilization. And he's very much hitting the nail on the head in that aspect, where we have, especially in these multi-ethnic and racial societies, where different caste systems are applied to these peoples retrospectively to how they just operate naturally. There is now this whole economic function, like Vincent was getting at, replacing that spiritual view and seeing these positions of actual patriarchal authority being made into mere symbolic gestures to put upon the aesthetic of civilization, kind of wearing the skin of a dead civilization, but the internal components being alien entirely. And we see that much the case now with these plebeian aristocracies, and the idea of propositional nations or civic nationalism in many respects, where we want to stay away from nationalism as it's identified by the plebeian in this context as well, but people hyper-focus on these terms as also the propositional nation and civic nationalism when referred especially to the nations of the West, most prominently America, because even though it was a nation founded by Anglo-Saxon Christians, it very much transformed quickly into a multinational, multi-ethnic sort of hodgepodge of cultures brewing together. And there were some good benefits that came out of it. There were some grand ideas and artistic movements that were produced because of this clash and air quote diversity. How that's also been a term co-opted and defiled by these Western progressive modernists.
Yeah.
But there was some benefit at first. That going on further and further, though, only leads to more destabilization as it goes on, and probably to an eventual balkanization down the road. And that's because there is no further aristocracy or core principle to the civilizations to hold it together in any way. And that's why he's calling it bourgeois, because it is focused so much on the material economic aspect of things, where people are maybe living in a materially satisfactory means of existence, but they are void completely of any real substantive tradition or religious or spiritual awakening or rite that they've been initiated into. And so it's just people with a lot of wealth not knowing how to actually dedicate themselves to something beyond those material vices that they kind of become enslaved into, or those conveniences that they become addicted to, much like, people ordering fast food on an app and having it delivered to their houses instead of going and buying groceries or growing their own food, which would have a much higher quality of nutrition and may take a little bit more time, but you'll get more out of it and spend less money doing it. But they are more focused on the convenience of the act rather than initiating themselves to produce a higher quality of living. That was a lot. Sorry.
Oh no, you're good. You're good. There is a lot to unpack there. But you mentioned the intellectual and aesthetic movements that came out from America being like a hodgepodge of different cultures. And I was going to interrupt you and say that what America has really turned into is one large economic zone with many nationalities, but no home nationality. Whereas America used to be a country. I would say the term country is quote unquote it is often stretched this way or that, and it doesn't really have any definable meaning. But generally speaking, America, I guess, as a nation, was definable up until around the time when it became a multi-ethnic, multinational,
empire
economic zone. Yeah, empire, I guess. Yeah. But regardless, as it stands now, it has no national identity, and that's we've discussed that in other podcasts and in writings and things like that. And it's true, it does not have a national identity, and it does not have any absolute reference points which would create a national identity. So all it really has is the principles of liberalism to go off of, and these are to be interpreted, through the lens of the interpreter. So these are up for debate themselves. So the identity of America, the identity of an American, is very much able to be questioned by pretty much everyone involved, and it seems that nobody really wants to partake in it because everyone sees some flaw or another with that identity. But you mentioned that the intellectual and the aesthetic movements that came about from America after it became this multi-ethnic grouping of people. And it's interesting because the passage that I'm looking at right here talks about how much the intellect is not how much the intellectual is not a good replacement for the aristocrat, the spiritual aristocrat. And it seems that is the number one thing that America was able to produce, was the intellectual. Not in the sense that, not like the spiritual intellectual or, one who understands a gnosis, but the intellectual in mathematical terms or in scientific terms, the book smart people in a sense. And while
I'd say, just to interject real quick, it might be easier to use the word sage instead of like spiritual intellectual.
Yeah, I guess that's it. I guess that's a good way to put it. But regardless, this type of intellectuality that America has seen, it's a very book smart type of orientation, which is not necessarily a bad thing to have in a society, but it needs to be positioned hierarchically in relation to something that is of a higher quality, because that does go into the realm of quantity a lot. So what he says here is, well, let me go back one page. Okay, he says, a typical example of the latter view of the so-called aristocracy of culture, or the aristocracy of intellectuals that arose as a byproduct of bourgeois civilization, during a consensus taken in the reign of Frederick the Great, the head of an ancient German noble family humorously replied, "Analphabet wegen des hohen Adels," in reference to the ancient notion of the British lords who were considered experienced in the law and learned, even though they may not know how to read. The truth is that in the context of a normal hierarchical view, the principle that determined the precise ontological and essential differences between people and was at the basis of the notion of aristocracy and of its privileges was never intellectuality, but rather spirituality. The tradition was preserved, though in an attenuated form, up to the time of the knightly nobility, where it was embodied in a somewhat ascetical and sacral aspect in the great medieval orders. At that point, the nobility already had its main reference point in the sacred, but not in, but outside itself, and in a separate class, namely the clergy. Although the clergy represented a spirituality that was still a far cry from the spirituality of the primordial elites. So, it kind of goes off into the weeds in the end there, but the idea that he's talking about is that you could be a very book-dumb aristocrat and still legitimate your position on the hierarchy because your spirit was of a qualitatively superior type than someone who may be intellectually superior to you by being able to read and understand, writing and mathematics and things like that. But that person would have a spiritually qualitatively subordinate or inferior nature to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if I may, I can add on to that and bring some modern context into the fold.
Yeah, sure.
In that reading there's the aspect, Dharma Nation. If you're familiar with his YouTube channel, he does a lot of streams and videos on the Vedic tradition and his teachings through Hinduism. He said recently on a stream with Philosophicate that for a sage and to be one of these sagely people like we just mentioned, it does take a lot of intellect. It does mean you have to be an intelligent person to actually go through and go down this route to become something like a patriciate in your society. That does not mean, though, that a person who just holds intelligence can become one of these sagely figures. There needs to be an honesty and humility in the pursuit of these higher ideals that get you to that goal and get you closer to God, in what he was saying in that stream. But in this context, it's getting closer to the heart and soul of your civilization and how that best sort of instinctually leads your people through this initiatic route of sageliness. And further on that old German saying, there is not necessarily a book dumb aspect about these people, because like it said, British lords who were very well read in law despite them not being able to read themselves, is just the ability for them to think in a different way. IQ being one of the measurements we have to go off of intellect is a high indicator of how you can problem solve things, even if you may not be well versed in something like reading or mathematics, but you can kind of articulate in your own mind a unconventional form to overcome these problems that you're faced, and even develop some weird mathematical equation to solve a problem that no one thought of previously because they're so stuck in the ways of the masses instead of this wholly new way of thinking. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to get into academia and the how I mentioned before, it being this new institution that people falsely conflate with a new initiatic mode, because it is a very feminine pursuit. Academia is this more feminine body, and that's why you get many men who are of this very high intellectual caliber hyper-focusing themselves on very specific fields of study. Something like Egyptology in the 2nd century or BC, or some other odd specific venture, like something in the sciences where they're a biochemist on, pancreatic cancer or something of that realm. And they're very, very good in this particular field. But outside of that, they're not a well-rounded person in any meaningful way whatsoever. You might even consider them dumb in a lot of aspects, but viciously intelligent in that specificity that they endeavor themselves in. And that's very much the way of academia with the female, and why statistically there is a higher percentage of women in the higher echelons of public school and even in higher education and university, where it's been formulated so that it placates to women's natural abilities and strengths on their own intellectual caliber, because there is a difference between that male and female brain, whereas the movers and shakers of society are these highly intellectual men that don't have that aspect of conformity that is necessary in academia, which is one of the strengths that plays into women's natural inclinations. And that's why this reign of academia and quantity by proxy has feminized society so much, and been an aspect of tearing down this patriarchal form of society that we've lived under for pretty much the dawn of civilization.
It's funny you mention that, because I was listening to another stream by Angel Millar. He was being interviewed by a guy named Rebel Spirit Radio. I think that was the title of the guy's podcast. So if you look that up, look up Rebel Spirit Radio, Angel Millar, Path of the Warrior Mystic, because he's interviewing him about his book. But what Angel Millar said on that stream was, he said that, in modernity, you are encouraged to find a niche, and then find a niche within that niche, and then a few small niches, and then find ultimately the last niche in that niche, and then that's your career.
Yeah.
Right? So,
Yep.
What he advocates for instead is kind of the same thing that I advocate for, is more generalization in and well-roundedness in the man, in the development of the man. And he talks about, I guess the justification that he gives is, why would you want to only develop half of yourself? He talks about how for as long as it's been popular in media, we've been dividing humans into these different categories, where you have the dumb jock, and you have the smart, nerdy, geeky guy who can't defend himself, that type of thing. Whereas, why would you as a nerd want to only develop your brain and not develop your body? And same thing as a jock, why would you only want to develop your body and not develop your brain? And so when he goes into this idea about the niches in career paths, it's, why would you want to dedicate your entire life to one small area of something that is so relative that you're not going to matter if you can't do these other things, ontologically and spiritually. So his idea was that you need to develop yourself as an entire person. That means that you should generally try to become good at multiple professions, or a jack of all trades. And I kind of live my life that way. I kind of dabble in multiple things. I do a lot of things, and I don't really focus all of my energy into any single one of them. And while I can't say that that's caused logistical problems in, actually following through, I meet my goals way less quicker than, or way less quickly than someone who might dedicate dedicate all of their entire life to one specific path. But I have a lot more goals to meet. And so that's the thing, is that I try to develop myself, very generally, as kind of like a Renaissance man, a jack of all trades, someone who is able to be very good at everything while not being specifically hyper-focused on one thing, if that makes sense. And so that's what he's...
Yeah, totally.
That's what
oh yeah, go
ahead.
If I may add to that too, it reminds me of a quote. I forget exactly where from, but it stated, if you separate your warriors from your intellectuals, you will have your thinking done by cowards and your fighting done by fools.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I've heard that one.
I'd have to look on the source on that again, but that's very much the thought for so many ancient civilizations, so many of these traditional civilizations, where they're, like we were mentioning last episode, the fusion of these different castes, like the Sikhs or the Spartans or the samurai, in these various traditional societies, excuse me, where they were expected to be learned men and able to kill a dozen lesser men on the battlefield without breaking a sweat. And that's just how it went, where the Spartans often looked down on Athenians because they, had a very good navy, but when it came to land wars or any sort of practical warfare, they got flattened out every single time, because they were dedicating themselves more so to the hyper-focused arts and sciences of their time. And, we got things like the Parthenon out of it, but that Athenian culture ended up getting, taken over and conquered by other more militaristically advanced societies that still had that balance of literature and art and so on. And the positives that Athenian society brought out in art got adopted by later empires like Rome. Although the same was true in the Japanese shogunate and the samurais that worked under them, or in the Sikhs and how they were both this priestly and warrior caste together. So they had to be learned spiritual men while also being able to defend the borders of their nation quite viciously.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, though. That's the entire idea, really, is that transmission of one element to another, and that's exactly why I was talking about the generalist, or someone who is a little bit more of a generalist themselves, because this idea of a well-rounded individual or a well-rounded society reflects this idea of spiritual holism that you can find in ancient societies that Evola mentions here. So it's got some credibility to it, and it just goes back. The only reason I brought it up really was because you mentioned that whole idea of finding a niche, and that's something that the traditional world and most spiritually oriented people would vehemently disagree with, and I think so would you.
Mm-hmm. But the chapter goes on, though, in talking about things like the Uranian or solar element of the Patriciate, on how they enjoyed the primacy over other elements of the same tradition, as Evola stated in later on.
Yeah. I'll briefly skim over the rest of it, because it is quite filled with a lot of examples now about the same idea, where it is the differentiation between the caste of the Patriciate, which is characterized as the caste that is able to perform the rites, the caste that is kind of on top of the social hierarchy in relation to the common folk and the laborers and the slaves and what have you. And it is the caste that has a spiritual ancestor, or someone to whom they can all look back at and say, my soul, or the waking eye state that is within me has directly derived from this. And so they participate in an initiation and become part of that spiritual lineage. Whereas the patrician is, or not the patrician, the plebeian is the caste that has none of that. So basically the plebeian caste would be the caste of the masses themselves, and their quote-unquote spiritual ancestor would be the stock of the masses. It would not be a quote-unquote race of heroes, or however they would put it. It would not have that blood transmission of any latent qualities whatsoever, and an initiation would have less of an effect on them than it would have on someone of the patriciate caste. So this chapter is dedicated to differentiating between the one versus the other, and outlining the superior nature of the patriciate caste, which has been long forgotten within modernity. But would you be ready to move on to spiritual virility?
There is the one last thing about it, though, because like we mentioned in the last episode, how these castes aren't hard and fast delineations between peoples that have no transmission between them. Evola does mention that in many of these traditional societies, when you have the patriarch at the head of any family, could at a whim cast out any biological son and adopt new sons
Oh,
into
yes.
to perform these rites and continue on the legacy of the family to keep that primordial fire going, as is he explains through different traditions like the Iranian 7 fires, or was it 3 fires for them and 7 for the Greeks for the noble families, and keeping that flame going, as they'd say. Um, and so modern practices like this even exist in Japan, where CEOs will adopt their proteges, the understudies for whom they're going to give the company to, so that the company can still be registered as a family business. But they feel most confident in this person that's been working in the industry, working in the company so long, that they've become initiated in this business and now have the right RIGHT to inherit what they've worked so hard into becoming, because that patriarch, that CEO, deemed it to be so, and they're the one that has the final say in who progenerates the company after that. And if that person does get adopted by that former CEO, they've shown right then and there that they've attained that level, that the former leader, the former patriarch, is comfortable with leaving the legacy behind in their hands.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring that up. I did forget about that part. So Evola says, in this way, natural relationships are not only secondary, but they may also be reversed. Thus, according to the same text, the Brahmana, who brings about the Vedic birth of an older person and who teaches him his own duties, becomes his father, according to law, even if he himself is a child. Wherever the law of patria potestas was considered, or wherever the law of patria potestas was considered from a social and juridical point of view to be absolute and almost superhuman, such a law could enjoy this spiritual character only if it had, or if it had originally had, such a justification in the order of spiritual paternity, and also if it was related to blood ties as the soul is related to the body within the organic unity of the family stock. So, yeah, that's a good point to bring up. I totally forgot about that last little bit.
Yeah, I think from there, spiritual virility is next to be delved into.
Yeah. Okay. So spiritual virility. This is a conception about. It's funny because this chapter is only about 5 pages long, maybe, but it's such an important one to get through because it details the importance of the. Oh, how would you say it? The substance of one's spirit, I guess you can say. The more virility a person has, the more quote-unquote spiritual power that person has, the more of a spiritual presence that person has. And so spiritual virility is important to kind of understand as a concept because it, going forward, we're going to talk about, conceptions which relate back to this capability of the individual. It's basically the like I said before, the spiritual presence of an individual. So Evola opens up. He says, so far I have discussed the roles that the sacred, the gods, the priestly caste, and the rites played in traditional societies. In the world of tradition, these things hardly correspond to categories typical of the domain of religion in the current sense of the word, based as it is on the notion of deities conceived as self-sufficient beings and the notion of God as a personal being who providentially rules the universe. Moreover, the cult is essentially characterized by an affective disposition and by a sentimental and devotional relationship of the believer to this supreme being or deities. In this type of relationship, the moral law plays the fundamental role. One would look in vain for religion in the original forms of the world of tradition. There are civilizations that never named their gods or attempted to portray them. At least this is what is said about the ancient Pelasgians. The Romans themselves, for almost 2 centuries, did not portray their deities. At most, they represented them with a symbolical object. What characterizes the primordial times is not animism, which is the idea that an anima is the foundation of the general representation of the divine and of the various forces at work in the universe, but rather the idea or perception of pure powers, adequately represented by the Roman view of the noumen. So the noumen, unlike the notion of deus, as it later came to be understood, is not a being or a person, but a sheer power that is capable of producing effects, of acting, and of manifesting itself. So think of the idea of mana, or of a latent essence within reality. That is what the Romans called noumen. The sense of the real presence of such powers, or noumena, as something simultaneously transcendent and yet immanent, marvelous yet fearful, constituted the substance of the original experience of the sacred. So, essentially, you would understand the velocity, or the the quality of the presence. I guess there's really no other word to describe it. I'm trying to think of one, but based upon the idea of noumena, or the presence of the noumena.
And Evola is right in pointing out that this is a strange way of thinking about it from our, more modern perspectives of things, or our more comfortable conceptions of how we view religion and spirituality and God itself, because of these ancient societies that never named or depicted their gods to begin with, but had this virility to them that existed in this ethereal way symbolically, like how we mentioned on that atheism episode, in how every aspect of becoming is a symbolical representation of that animism, from which capital G God manifests in the real world. And that's very similar to how the Vedic tradition sees it from, I forget the god's name, the overarching god that oversees the entire pantheon. But if you know, and that's kind of how it plays out, but without getting into a identifiable persona in a way, like that animism he's talking about. And then he goes on throughout the chapter saying that these depictions of this virility become increasingly more human, and thereby limiting their ability and power throughout their spiritual powers, I guess you could say, because that what is more human is more material and more degenerative in our own narcissistic perception of the universe. So, like how the Roman gods then get depicted in these beautiful marble statues, previously they were more symbolic gestures of these forces of nature that had to be brought under control by these ritualistic acts that ancient traditional societies acted upon. And you could even think of those same beliefs being manifested in more material ideologies of the modern day of our society, with things like the climate crisis, people, those in modern medicine, like with the, disease that shall not be named because of different internet subjugations, and so on and so forth, with the sciences and medicine and other pseudo-religious aspects of people's modern perceptions that are far more materialistic and far more human, even if they're not being personified in human means, but they're very much these human pathos, like Evola said, that this pathos that is being exemplified through our fears and anxieties and marvels, but being ever more degenerated in our own here and now.
Yeah. I guess the best way I would describe it is the spiritual virility is the amount of divinity that is present within one given person, how divine a person is. It's that person's divine presence. And so the more divinity is present within them, the more virility they have. That's essentially the best way to kind of characterize it. And so you could become a spiritually virile person, or you could be a spiritually virile person by nature of initiation, or by nature of birth, or it is simply a nature of circumstance. And it is a hierarchical qualification of a person that determines the the quality and the value of that person when relating to spiritual subjects. So Evola writes, with regard to the rite, there was nothing religious about it. So he says the rite, R-I-T-E. With regard to the rite, there was nothing religious about it, and little or no devout pathos in those who performed it. the rite was rather a divine technique, a determining action upon invisible forces, and inner states similar in spirit to what today is obtained through physical forces and states of matter. So, think of the rite as operating an invisible machine through a technique that is only understood intuitively or through the transmission or initiation of one person. So there's no hand manual on how to perform the rite. It is a technique which has been adapted and changed and learned about, basically discovered by the spiritual elite or the folks who have that spiritual virility about them. So he says the priest was simply a person who, by virtue of his qualification and the virtues intrinsic to the rite itself, was capable of producing results through this technique. Religion was the equivalent of indigitamenta, it's a Latin word, of the Roman world, namely of the body of formulations used with different noumena. Thus, it is easy to see that if prayers, fears, hopes, and other feelings displayed before what has the character of a numen had as little meaning and effect upon it as if one of our contemporaries were to employ prayers when confronting a machine. Instead, what was at stake was to be able to understand such relationships so that once a cause was established through a correctly performed rite, a necessary and constant effect would ensue on the plane of quote-unquote powers and invisible forces and states of being. Thus, the law of action reigns supreme. But the law of action is also the law of freedom. No bond can be spiritually imposed on beings who neither hope nor fear, but rather act. This is the part.
To add on that, in the next page, he goes on and says that orthodoxy was defined through rituals and practices, not through dogmas and theories. Sacrilege and impiety did not consist of in not believing, but rather in neglecting rites. This does not amount to the formalism, as modern historians who are more or less influenced by Protestant mentality would have us believe, but rather the pure law of spiritual action. And so that's what brings it back to my application of the sciences and medicines and so on and so forth, because there are so many that might be true believers in the more plebeian aspect of societies, but those who are a modern pseudo-priestly caste in this materialistic sense may not actually believe or buy into the rituals that they're performing. People knowing the ineffectiveness of it, but going along with the ritualistic aspect of it anyways, because they felt that they'd be neglecting their rights in this new material religion that the elites who rule society currently wanted to impose upon the population. And you could see how degenerative that mentality is on our elites because of how much resistance was put up by the plebeian against our ruling elite, much because our ruling elite are plebeian themselves. So you can see these degenerations right before our very eyes, and also the examples that Evola is saying without having to get too esoteric or imaginative with the histories that might be lost to us that he is getting at.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, but I mentioned that I was going to mention that this was the part that I was looking to get to, but all of that information kind of had to be said before this information was said. But this right here is the meat and potatoes of the chapter, right? He says, thus in the older Indo-Aryan view of the world, only the Brahmana caste, consisting as it did of superior natures, could tower over everybody else, since it ruled over the powers of the right, or of Brahman, understood in this context as the vital and primordial principle. The gods themselves, when they are not personifications of the ritual action, that is, beings who are actualized or renewed by this action, are spiritual forces that bow before this caste. According to the Far Eastern tradition, a person who has the authority also enjoys the dignity of a third power between heaven and earth. In ancient Egypt, even the great gods could be threatened with destruction by priests who knew special sacred incantations. So that's kind of what I was getting at, is that the idea of a god, or the deified presence of a principle, is subordinate to someone who knows the techniques to control it. It's almost like wrangling a god, in very profane senses, in very profane terms. The idea of spiritual virility is someone who possesses the knowledge and the capability and the quality to enact that technique that might have more power within them than a god would have within it, because that god is itself simply a symbol or a manifestation of a principle which can be controlled by the person with the spiritual virility. It's a very deep concept to try to get into, and it goes with the idea of magic, especially in the occult sense, and there's that left hand versus right hand path, and all of that type of stuff which you'll get when going into the occult. But it very much has to do with this idea of spiritual virility and the capability of one person to tower over primordial forces or localized gods. So not tower over capital G God or existence, or what was it, subsistence, existence itself, or anything like that. Mm-hmm. It's these localized gods that the spiritually virile person has control over. And so that's essentially what the chapter is getting at. Everything else... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you can see that today, too, like I keep mentioning, with the how would you say, reinforcement or the uplift of people like experts being thrust in front of the cameras in modern society and dictating fundamental, truths of reality to be untrue all of a sudden. And we've seen that in the last few years with things like biology and virology and so many other aspects about our lives, economics and so forth, by these experts that are now, just by virtue of their hyper specification that they've gotten a degree in, and they've been given the blessing by the cathedral or the elites at hand to cite these incantations, bring up their degrees and eradicate these old gods and instate new ones to bring about a change that they find necessary, that they want to impose upon society. And again, you can see these truths are still laid out in society, just in a more material and degenerative way.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because it is an interesting analogy, because I guess maybe analogy is not quite the right word, but...
that's just how it is.
Yeah.
Just degenerated.
Yeah, it is exactly the same way. It's like I said, the same form, but a hollow shell of its former self. Or the substance or the material that it's being made up with is way different than the material that it's supposed to be made up with, or the material that it was traditionally known to be made up of. Because you can't rid these aspects to society. You can't rid a social hierarchy no matter what. It's just what determines that social hierarchy and what qualifies the people who hold a position within it. And Evola's getting at the technical aspect of what truly characterizes that patrician, what truly characterizes that person with spiritual virility, what truly characterizes the plebeian, and what is the type of person who can never be a patrician or who can never aspire to that position in society. And these rules that he's laying out are very clear, and when followed, they work. But in no way is he ever suggesting that an inverse of the form is possible, simply the essence. And so what we see today is that inverse of that essence, while the form is still more or less intact in a lesser sense or in a lesser way.
And he says that here towards the end of the chapter, that this hyper-realistic world that was substantiated with pure and sheer action was replaced with a sub-real and confused world of emotions, imagination, hopes, and fears.
Yeah. Yep.
And that this world becomes increasingly human and powerless, being followed its various stages of general involution. Like I mentioned before, that anima, or the narcissistic implication of personifying these forces of nature as human-like deities, is what degenerated those traditions further into modernity, and what had those ancient societies turn modern themselves and fall and crumble for new, more degenerative but better than the fall point societies to take place.
Yeah.
In their stead.
Now, I mentioned that this has to do with magic, and so he says So Evola says, only vis-a-vis this decadence is it possible to distinguish the regal and priestly functions. Even when a priestly class ruled without departing from the pure traditional spirit, as in the case of ancient India, it had a much more magical and regal character. It had a much more magical and regal rather than religious character, in the usual sense of the word religious. So, this is what I was referencing when I said occult magic and stuff like that. When I reference that, he says, when I say magical, I do not mean what today the majority of people think when they hear the term magic, which is almost always discredited by prejudices and counterfeits. Nor do I refer to the meaning the term acquires when referred to the sui generis empirical science typical of antiquity, which was rather limited in its scope and effects. Magic in this context designates a special attitude towards spiritual reality itself, an attitude of centrality that is closely related to the regal tradition and initiation. So, in essence, spiritual virility is closely related to magic in the primordial sense, in the regal sense, and it is what is considered before the devotional religion. Now, one thing I kind of want to get at here is that Evola talks about spiritual virility and the traditional society being prior to religion, and religion being understood as that devotion of one individual to either a group of people or to a cause or to a power or to a god or something of that sort. And so I don't think necessarily that he's wrong. I do think that this is outside of religion. But there are considerations that have to be made for the caste of the common folk, which is that a certain exoteric formalism or a certain initiatic tradition for the plebeian, for example, a religion, is necessary to keep them kind of in line. So you did have these spiritual cults that arose now and again, and these didn't necessarily require one person to be of an aristocratic origin. It is simply the cult of aristocracy itself required one person to be of an aristocratic origin. There were lesser rites that were performed by people who may have been initiated into a certain group or into a certain tradition that were not of that aristocratic origin, but still had some type of metaphysical significance. But this was, again, representative of an upheaval of the power of the rites held by that aristocratic person, or by the sage, as it were, and other things like that. So I think that, kind of carrying on from Evola's words here, is that there is religion, which is for that common caste folk. Essentially, there is devotional religion, and that devotion is required because the common caste folk do not understand the why of the why behind the devotion, whereas the priestly caste and the aristocratic caste is almost above that type of devotion because they are fully immersed in the religious waters or the spiritual waters that the exoteric tradition manifested by that religion derives from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think from there we might be able to move on to the last chapter of today's episode.
Yep. So, Two Paths in the Afterlife deals with the topic obviously stated in the chapter title, Two Paths in the Afterlife. So, different religions have various characteristics of what goes on after death. You have obviously the Christian idea of heaven and hell. You have the Norse pagan idea of Valhalla and all of that good stuff. You have the Roman ideal, the ancient Chinese and Shinto idea. So what this chapter does is kind of finds the unity between all of those various forms. So this is a very interesting chapter because Evola was very much concerned with the afterlife. He was concerned with what comes after death and how to manipulate that. And so his research into this is the most in-depth research I can find on the topic that is not some type of modern historian doing research on a form that they don't necessarily believe in. This is someone who believed in, quite rigorously believed in what he was saying, and so researched these as if they were real, and so understands them probably deeply, or more deeply than any historian could claim to have an understanding of these concepts. So he starts off by saying, At this point, it is necessary to discuss the connection between the order of ideas that I've outlined so far and the problem of one's destiny in the afterlife. In this context, too, reference should be made to teachings that have almost entirely been lost in recent times. The belief that everybody's soul is immortal is rather odd. Very little evidence of it can be found in the world of tradition. In tradition, a distinction was made between true immortality, which corresponded to a participation in the Olympian nature of a god, and mere survival. So, true immortality is obtained by someone who is of that patrician caste, who has made that ontological shift in status, has initiated themselves, and is now the father or the patrician of, or the ancestor of a patrician family, if that makes sense. So, also, various forms of possible survival came into play, and the problem of the postmortem condition of each individual was analyzed, always taking into consideration the various elements present in the human aggregate. Since man was far from being reduced to the simple binomial soul-body. What continuously emerges in various forms in ancient traditions is the teaching that in man, in addition to the physical body, there are essentially three entities or principles, each endowed with its own character and destiny. The first principle corresponds to the conscious I typical of the waking state, which arose with the body and was formed in parallel with its biological development. This is what we most commonly call consciousness, right? This is the ordinary personality. The second principle was called daemon, manes, or lar, and even double. The third and the last principle corresponds to what proceeds from the first entity after death. For most people, it is the shadow. As long as the person belongs to quote-unquote nature, which would be like our natural reality right now, the ultimate foundation of a human being is the daemon or the demon. In this context, the term does not have the evil connotation Christianity bestowed upon it. When a man is considered from a naturalistic point of view, the demon could be defined as the deep force that originally produced consciousness in the finite form that is the body, in which it lives during its residence in the visible world. So
to kind of translate and
I was just gonna say
transition from the reading. It's like how we were differentiating it with the soul, and so to speak. That first part, the conscious I, which Evola said and Vincent reinforced, is that consciousness, that self-awareness that you exist in your daily life. But this demon or daemon, mans, lar, however you want to call it, is more of how Evola got to it as like a ancestral spirit. He gets into totems down the line in a few pages, and how that corresponds with these familial memories, these some might say like blood memories, and actions and behaviors that kind of guide you in this conscious state of the living, and how it might be that spirit or soul you feel to belong with, sort of the internal compass that would guide you towards the caste or profession or whatever that you most belong to, because it's some sort of guiding principle beyond your physical form. And that's that compound nature of the spirit or soul that is progenerated through family lines, and could be exemplified through that anima, which he was getting at in the previous chapter, and through things like totems in various societies, whether they be Egyptian or Native American or so forth, that exemplify and personify these traditional familial elements, and bear that torch and keep that fire going, as was discussed in the chapter 6, so that a new patriarch can move forward in the world without abandoning those guiding principles that got, that bloodline to where they are.
Yeah. And so, you were mentioning that he does bring up totems, and he does. So, in essence, what happens after death, what he has gathered in his study, is that there are two paths for two fundamentally different types of people. There is the path of the common caste plebeian, which is generally the path that is walked by most people. And then there is the path of the hero. And the hero is not necessarily someone who has descended from this plebeian caste, but it is, not plebeian, patrician caste, but it is the ancestor or patrician himself, and only a person who follows in their footsteps or receives an initiation and maintains the rite, only that person can also enjoy this type of afterlife. So the most common type of the most common path in the afterlife is that of the plebeian, and he basically says at the death of the body of an ordinary person. At the death of the body, an ordinary person usually loses his or her personality, which was an illusory thing even while that person was alive. The person is then reduced to a shadow that is itself destined to be dissolved over a more or less lengthy period, culminating in what was called the second death. The essential vital principle of the deceased returned to the totem, which is a primordial, perennial, and inexhaustible matter. Life will again proceed from this matter and assume other individual forms, all of which are subject to the same destiny. So, a little bit earlier, we mentioned totems. He basically says that the demon or the totem is essentially the same thing. The demon kind of comes out from the totem. You can understand the demon as being the spirit of a person. It is the individual piece of a stock or of a larger piece that generates a force within the individual, which then becomes the soul or the waking eye state. So the demon is essentially what connects that person back to a larger stock spiritually. And so, generally speaking, the manes or the lar, or however you would say it, it is basically this idea of the source of the demon or the source of the spirit. This is represented in the totemic religions as a totem. So the masses come from the ancestral totem, which doesn't always have a patrician character to it, and it also could be characterized as being almost lesser to the patrician ancestor because the totem is the stock of the masses itself. So basically
what Evola kind of tries to get at in this, from the culmination of his research, is that there are a series of reincarnations and annihilations of the soul coming from these two paths of the afterlife.
Yes and no. Hold on, let me stop you.
Yeah, I was just gonna get to it.
Okay.
In the highest sense, the patriciate enters that sense of Olympian immortality, and those are the ones that kind of exist in this Valhalla-like state where they become demigods of their own right, as he says, with the funeral rites of those heroes and people who fell on the battlefield, or those in the priestly caste of these various societies, like Vikings being burned on the funeral pyre, or Egyptian pharaohs being mummified, and nobles going the same way. They're ones that have dedicated themselves to that higher being of in the material world, and transition into that other state of I guess spiritual fulfillment. Whereas the plebeian, depending on your point of view, as the Egyptians saw it with Amamit, or the Devourer Amam, is a annihilation of the soul, or in the Vedic traditions, a reincarnation into another body, and then people have to formulate themselves in this totem-like way to climb the totems and reach that level of patriciate, and then they'll be able to get themselves out of this loop or free themselves of annihilation through that culmination of spiritual ascension in their own life.
Yeah. He says the essential vital principles of the deceased return to the totem, which is a primordial, perennial, and inexhaustible matter. Life will again proceed from this matter and assume other individual forms, all of which are subject to the same destiny. This is the reason why totems, manes, lars, or penates were identified with the dead, the cult of the ancestors, the demons, and the invisible generating force that is present in everybody was often confused with the cult of the dead. So, in a sense, the way that the totem works and the way that the demon works, I would picture the totem as a body of water, right? And you can scoop out one little bit of water with a cup, right? And you use that cup to water the plant. Now, let's say, for example, that water stays with the plant its whole life, and the plant grows from that water. But at the end of the plant's life, the water is taken back from that plant and dumped into the big basin. Now, the same water, the same exact water, can never water another plant again. But the same water can be dipped into, the same source can be dipped into to use to water another plant. Now, do this a whole bunch of times, and you have a bunch of plants that come from the same stock or the same essence or the same essential basin of water, but have different bits of that water within them, giving them life. And then at the end of their life, it goes back into that same fundamental pool, or the culmination or amalgamation of the essence of everyone's life, or the essence of all the plants, or, for example, all of the water. So you're not getting the same type of reincarnation you would get where one exact soul is transposed from one body to the next, but what you might get is more or less the same essence of a soul that comes from the same primordial substance of the totem, or the manes, or the lar, however, whatever you want to characterize it as. So that's why that joke, back to the totem exists, because, you're in a sense telling someone to go back to that primordial state where they had no individuality, no personality. And you're essentially saying, go back to, or be dissolved back within the masses from which you came. And so then there's that idea of the patrician who doesn't go back to the totem. He, in a sense, is someone who has accomplished a feat, and death for him is more like a rebirth. In a sense, it's, I think Evola puts it as, I think he says, yeah, in these instances, death did not represent an end, but a fulfillment. It was a triumphal death, bestowing immortality, and was the reason why in some Hellenic traditions the deceased was called hero, and the dying was called generating demigods. And dying was called generating demigods. So in a sense, if you were this heroic individual, this one of the patrician caste who raised yourself ontologically through the performing of certain feats or what have you, or being initiated, or doing something substantial to really set yourself apart spiritually, and to gather enough spiritual virility to set you apart from the plebeian castes, this is when you underwent that triumphal death, and achieved this immortal status of a demigod, or of deification of an individual, and became that, and went through that second path of the afterlife. So in Christianity, you have go ahead.
There's one thing we glossed over a little bit there, and that was the second death that Evola kind of touched on too.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really explore too much besides the citations with that Egyptian concept of the devourer imam, and how that's reinterpreted or perceived differently in different cultures. Capital T traditional and little t traditional as well, where you can see it in holidays like Dia de los Muertos, or the Japanese Day of the Dead, whereas the former was Mexican, the latter is Japanese. But I think there's even a Madagascan tradition that's similar as well, and can be found around the world, with various cultures honoring those family members, those people from their totem that they celebrate and they give life back to, because there was some French philosopher, I believe, that said you suffer two deaths: when you actually die, and when someone utters your name for the last time. And that is a far more common concept of the second death for most, I think, small t traditional societies, and where these, I think, influenced bigger t traditions come from, in, say, Japan or Mexico, or even places like China, where they have family shrines, which, most Asiatic countries do. But there seems to be dedicated portions of a family property, like, say, you're watching Mulan, and she goes to her family shrine and prays to her ancestors for protection in what she's about to do. And, all of her ancestors' spirits come out and say, she's crazy, but I guess we got to help her because she's family. And it's that same kind of concept where you're honoring those family members because they are the ones that came before you and provided for you that water to the plant life that you are now drinking, as to ride on your analogy, Vincent. And so it's this play on perpetuating those family ties and hoping that the patriciate comes about in your family lineage to kind of have everyone ascend into that higher nature of being, at least from these different cultures' perspectives, so that no one has to suffer that second death and everyone's forgotten in this land of the dead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One last thing also, I kind of glossed over this as well. Evola kind of ends by saying, I will not say that the shift from the totems of those primitive populations to a traditional regality was a historic development. At most, it was an evolution in an ideal sense. Excuse me. A regal or an aristocratic tradition arises wherever there is dominion over the totems and not dominion of the totems, and wherever the bond is inverted and the deep forces of the stock are given a superbiological orientation by a supernatural principle in the direction of an Olympian victory and immortality. So, it's not necessarily the most important thing in the world, but basically what he's saying is that once this force is able to be controlled by the people through the rite, this is when the change is made from a more tribal, totemic society to a more traditional regality, to a more, like capital T traditional regality, in the sense that the rites do hold some type of sway over the previously unharnessed forces of the totem or of the ancestral stock. So it is very much in relation to those celebrations of the Day of the Dead and whatnot. It's that type of idea, wherever there is a control over the totems.
Anything from there?
No, that was just it. This was kind of the end of the chapter here, so I think we can kind of end it there. Do you have any closing statements about the topics at hand before we do so?
Not particularly. I guess the only thing you could say is there's one little section here that I highlighted and wanted to comment on today's degeneration and domestication is Evola stating to free human beings to free human beings from the dominion of the totems, to strengthen them, to address them to the fulfillment of a spiritual form and a limit, and to bring them into the invisible way of the line, influences capable of creating a destiny of heroic and liberating immortality. This was the task of the aristocratic cult. So that kind of brings the last 6, 7, 8 chapters all together now, with the responsibility of a true aristocracy providing for the people to allow the plebeian to be able to become that heroic liberator of their family line, to become that immortalized influence of your totem.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's been desecrated in that fact where in modernity we have aristocrats living only within their material lifespans and caring about only the satisfactions they get from their hedonistic vices, and rejecting any idea of honoring your ancestors or providing for your descendants thereof. And we've come into such a state where those totems are being chopped down and destroyed and obliterated entirely, with people ending their bloodlines, ending their own lives prematurely even, and condemning themselves to a psychological and maybe even literal hell coming into the afterlife because of the dysgenic way of living that they've produced in their natural lifespan. And like we've mentioned previously with the cult of convenience and all these other misnomers to rites and ritual that we've replaced in modern society, we can see that becoming a factor of domestication to modern man, and how people are so much more complacent and agreeable to things that our ancestors would otherwise have like burned the entire thing down over.
Right.
So you can kind of see that in that lack of heroic action or nature in the population surrounding us, and that might be telling of where society is heading for the future. And hopefully, men like us, Vincent and I, listeners, whomever else, may be those men amongst the ruins, as Evola states in his other book of the same name, to reinstantiate that capital T tradition in a more progenitive, I guess, progenitive sense than how it's degenerated in the times of our parents and grandparents and maybe a little further back.
Yeah. Yeah. I say that's a good. Say that's a good way of putting it, because you can like you said, you can still see the old hollow shell of the formal capital T or the former capital T traditional society. All of the blocks are still there because in tradition the none of the emptiness was present. In a sense, it was all of the hierarchical functions were understood, and all of them were attended to in a proper fashion, in the sense that the primordial truths of the universe or of reality or what have you were in a sense adapted into this idea of an esoteric and exoteric formal tradition that was the law of the land, in a very codified and very strict and rigid fashion that was understood by everyone and that was maintained in some way by everyone who, yeah, sure, you would have various rebellions here and there, but there were ways to deal with it and to get around it and to not hyper-focus on the principle of rebellion itself being the most fundamental principle of all. And so that's where I really think we went down, I guess, since the Enlightenment, is that the idea today is that all of these hierarchical functions and all of these qualitative values that are placed upon certain things are not the chief point of reference, but instead the liberation from the shackles of this hierarchy, these qualitative characteristics and things like that. The liberation itself is the most focused on attribute to society. And so this is why we get this very negative attitude towards reality manifesting, especially among the youth or among people who hold this value near and dear to their heart, because their entire worldview is formulated around this one single concept that kind of hates everything that is intrinsic and true to reality. And I think that that's the number one thing we need to undo is this orientation towards rebellion and things like that. But that's kind of getting off into the weeds. But yes, today we dealt with the primordial nature of the Patriciate, spiritual virility, and the two paths in the afterlife. I think they were pretty substantial chapters and important to the narrative of Revolt Against the Modern World. I heard you were going to say something, so go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say that I think that's a great sentiment to leave off on. And yeah, these 3 chapters were definitely very heavy conceptually, and then brought in a lot of context to how these processes are reflecting on our modern daily lives.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is, we're getting into the section of the book now where almost everything that's said needs to be taken with, it needs to be understood with precise care, because there's a lot to go over. There's a lot to go over, and there's a lot that's said. It's a very dense next few chapters, so I look forward to going through that with you. But yeah, I would like to thank everyone for joining in to today's podcast. Be sure to leave a like if you think it deserved one, and if you would like to see more of us, you can check our description for the social media links that we have. And if you would like to join us, you can also contact us using any of the provided methods below. But thank you once again, Cody.
As always.
My name is Vincent, and I hope to see you back here next time at the Praxis Table Talks.